Detective Tommy Chen walked through the police station like he owned the place. His partner, Officer Jake Thompson, followed close behind, both men wearing that confident swagger that comes from 15 years of getting away with whatever they all wanted. Their badges weren't just pieces of metal pinned to their uniforms. To them, those badges were shields that made them untouchable. The morning started like any other. Tommy grabbed his coffee from the break room, nodding to the other officers, who stepped aside to let him through. He'd earned his reputation as someone who got results, and everyone knew it. The arrest numbers didn't lie. Neither did the commendations hanging in his locker. "Another quiet night in paradise," Jake said, settling into his desk chair. He was younger than Tommy by about 5 years, but he'd learned everything he knew about police work from his partner. And what he'd learned was simple. Trust your gut, don't take any nonsense, and always back up your fellow officers. Tommy laughed, pulling up the incident reports from the night shift. "Quiet's good for business. Means we did our job right yesterday." He scrolled through the reports, shaking his head at some of the calls. "Look at this nonsense, 3 noise complaints from the same apartment complex. Why don't these people just handle their own problems?" The apartment complex Tommy was talking about sat on the east side of town. It wasn't the worst neighborhood, but it wasn't the best either. Mostly working families trying to get by, but Tommy and Jake saw it differently. To them, it was a place where trouble lived, where people who didn't belong in their city gathered to cause problems. Lieutenant Patterson's voice boomed across the bullpen. "Chen, Thompson, my office." The two partners exchanged a look. Patterson had been their lieutenant for the past 8 years, and he'd always had their backs. When complaints came in about their methods, Patterson made them disappear. When community leaders asked questions about arrest patterns, Patterson had answers that satisfied the higher-ups. He was old school, just like them. They walked into Patterson's office with easy confidence. The man behind the desk looked tired, older than his 58 years. His gray hair had gotten grayer and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but he still commanded respect. "Sit down, boys," Patterson said, gesturing to the chairs across from his desk. "I've got some news." Tommy leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. "What's going on, Lieutenant? Please tell me it's not another sensitivity training session." Patterson actually smiled at that. "No, nothing like that. Though, speaking of training..." He paused, looking at both men carefully. "I'm retiring." The words hit the room like a thunderbolt. Jake sat up straighter. Tommy's easy smile faded. "When?" Tommy asked. "End of the month. 30 years is enough. My wife wants to travel, and honestly, I'm ready to let someone else deal with all the paperwork and politics." Jake was the first to recover. "Well, congratulations, Lieutenant, you've earned it. Any idea who's taking over?" Patterson shrugged. "That's above my pay grade. Captain Rodriguez will make the announcement next week, but between you and me, I hope it's someone who understands how real police work gets done." After they left Patterson's office, Tommy and Jake spent the rest of their shift speculating about who would replace him. The obvious choice was Detective Williams from downtown. He'd been around almost as long as Patterson, and understood the way things worked. There was also Sergeant Murphy from Narcotics, who'd always been friendly with their crew. "Whoever it is, they'll need to understand our track record," Tommy said as they drove through their usual patrol route. "We've got the highest arrest rate in the district. Our clearance rate is through the roof. The numbers speak for themselves." Jake nodded, watching the streets through the passenger window. "Think it might be someone from outside the department?" "No way," Tommy said confidently. "They always promote from within. Besides, they need someone who knows the community, knows how to handle the problem areas." They spent the afternoon handling routine calls. A fender bender on Main Street. A shoplifting report at the electronics store. A domestic disturbance that turned out to be neighbors arguing over a parking space. Easy stuff that reminded them why they were good at their jobs. But it was their last call of the day that really showed their approach to police work. A report of suspicious activity at the East Side apartment complex, the same one that had generated those noise complaints. The call came in as suspicious person loitering. When they arrived, they found a young man in a college sweatshirt standing near the mailboxes, talking on his phone. He was black, probably in his early 20s, and he was animated in his conversation. Tommy and Jake approached with their hands resting on their equipment belts. It was a stance that communicated authority. Without being openly aggressive, Tommy had perfected it over the years. "Excuse me," Tommy called out. "Can we talk to you for a minute?" The young man looked up, surprised. He ended his phone call quickly. "Yes, officer. Is there a problem?" "We got a call about suspicious activity." "What are you doing here?" "I live here," the young man said, pointing toward one of the apartment buildings. "Building C, apartment 304. I was just checking my mail and talking to my girlfriend." Jake stepped closer. "You got ID?" The question made the young man nervous, which Tommy noticed immediately. In his experience, nervous people usually had something to hide. "Sure," the young man said, reaching slowly for his wallet. "Here's my license, and here's my student ID from the community college." Tommy looked at the IDs but didn't seem satisfied. "What were you doing walking around the parking lot for 20 minutes?" "I wasn't walking around for 20 minutes. I just got here 5 minutes ago." That's not what the witness said. There hadn't been a witness, not really. The complaint had been vague, probably from someone looking out their window who didn't like what they saw. But Tommy had learned that mentioning witnesses usually got people talking. The young man looked confused and frustrated. "I don't know what to tell you. I live here. I was getting my mail. I haven't done anything wrong." After another 10 minutes of questions that went nowhere, they let him go. Tommy made a note in his report about suspicious behavior and evasive answers, even though the young man had answered every question directly. "Good catch," Jake said as they walked back to their patrol car. "Guy was definitely nervous about something," Tommy nodded. "You develop instincts after a while. Something wasn't right about his story." They finished their shift and headed back to the station. In the locker room, they ran into Officer Davis, who'd heard about Patterson's retirement. "End of an era," Davis said, shaking his head. "Patterson was one of the good ones. Understood that sometimes you've got to bend the rules to get the job done. Whoever takes over will figure that out quick enough," Tommy said. "The job teaches you reality pretty fast." As they headed home that evening, neither Tommy nor Jake had any idea that their comfortable world was about to change completely. They'd built their careers on assumptions about authority, community, and their own judgment. They'd operated under a system that protected them and validated their methods. Lieutenant Patterson had been more than just their boss. He'd been their shield against accountability, their translator when community complaints got too loud, their protector when their methods drew attention from higher up the chain of command. Now that shield was disappearing and a new era was about to begin. An era that would challenge everything they thought they knew about police work, about their community, and about themselves. But for now, they went home to their families, confident that tomorrow would be just like today, and that their badges would continue to make them untouchable in a world that was about to prove them very, very wrong. The rumors started on Monday morning. Officer Davis heard from someone in records that the new lieutenant was coming from Internal Affairs. Officer Martinez whispered to her partner that it might be someone from the state police. By Tuesday, half the station was convinced it would be Detective Williams from downtown, and the other half was betting on Sergeant Murphy from narcotics. Tommy and Jake listened to all the gossip with amused confidence. They'd worked with Williams on several cases, and Murphy had always been one of their drinking buddies. Either choice would mean business as usual, maybe with some minor adjustments to keep the brass happy. $10 says it's Williams, Jake said, stirring his coffee in the break room. He's got the seniority, and Captain Rodriguez likes him. Tommy shook his head. Murphy's got my vote. He knows how to handle the political stuff without getting in the way of real police work. Officer Davis joined their conversation, lowering his voice. I heard from my cousin who works downtown that they're bringing in someone from outside the department, someone with a degree and all that fancy training. That would be a mistake, Tommy said firmly. You can't learn this job from textbooks. You need someone who's been in the trenches, who understands how things really work on the street. Wednesday brought more speculation. Someone claimed they'd seen a black sedan with government plates in the visitor parking lot. Another officer swore they'd overheard Captain Rodriguez on a phone call mentioning community relations experience. The theories got wilder by the hour. Thursday afternoon, Captain Rodriguez finally put an end to the rumors. He sent out an email to all personnel. Mandatory meeting Friday morning at 8 sharp to meet the new lieutenant. No exceptions, no excuses. Tommy and Jake spent Thursday evening at their usual bar, joined by several other officers from their shift. The conversation naturally turned to the upcoming announcement. Whoever it is, they're going to need to understand our success rate, Tommy said, nursing his beer. Our clearance numbers don't lie. We get results. Officer Stevens nodded in agreement. Patterson always backed us up because he knew we got the job done. New guy will learn the same thing. What if it's some college boy who's never worked a real case? Davis asked. Jake laughed. Then we'll teach him. Reality has a way of correcting book learning pretty quick. They spent another hour sharing stories about soft supervisors they'd broken in over the years, each tale getting more exaggerated with each telling. By the time they headed home, they were completely confident that whoever the new lieutenant turned out to be, they'd have him figured out within a week. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly. The entire department crowded into the main briefing room, the largest space in the building. Tommy and Jake arrived early and claimed seats in the front row, right where they always sat for important announcements. It was a power move, a way of showing everyone that they belonged at the center of things. Captain Rodriguez looked nervous as he checked his watch and shuffled his papers. He was a decent enough administrator, but he'd always let Patterson handle the day-to-day management of the patrol division. Now he was going to have to work directly with whoever Patterson's replacement turned out to be. Good morning, everyone, Rodriguez began. As you all know, Lieutenant Patterson is retiring after 30 years of distinguished service. His replacement comes to us with an impressive background in law enforcement, including extensive experience in community policing and department reform initiatives. Tommy and Jake exchanged a quick look. Department reform sounded like code for making their jobs harder. Lieutenant James Washington has served with distinction in internal affairs, has a master's degree in criminal justice, and has successfully implemented community engagement programs in 3 different departments. The name hit Tommy like a physical blow. James Washington, internal affairs, master's degree, community engagement. Every phrase made his stomach sink a little lower. Please join me in welcoming Lieutenant Washington to our department. The door at the back of the room opened, and a tall, distinguished black man in a perfectly pressed uniform walked toward the front. He moved with quiet confidence, his posture straight and professional. His presence seemed to fill the room even before he spoke. Tommy felt his mouth go dry. Jake's confident smile froze on his face. This wasn't Detective Williams with his easygoing attitude and flexible interpretation of procedures. This wasn't Sergeant Murphy with his old boy network connections. This was something else entirely. Lieutenant Washington stepped to the podium and surveyed the room with calm, intelligent eyes. When his gaze swept over the front row, Tommy had the uncomfortable feeling that he was being studied, cataloged, and evaluated all in the space of a few seconds. Thank you, Captain Rodriguez, Washington said, his voice carrying easily through the room without needing to be raised. I'm honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you. He paused, letting his eyes move across the assembled officers again. I know change can be unsettling. New leadership always brings questions about how things will be done, what priorities will be emphasized, what standards will be expected. Tommy shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Something about Washington's tone suggested he wasn't going to be the kind of supervisor who worried about making people comfortable. I want to be clear about my approach from the beginning, Washington continued. This department has a responsibility to serve every member of our community with professionalism, respect, and accountability. Every citizen deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their neighborhood, their background, or their circumstances. Jake glanced sideways at Tommy, who was staring straight ahead with a fixed expression. I've spent the last 2 weeks reviewing departmental statistics, case files, and community feedback, Washington said, I've noticed some patterns that concern me. Response times that vary significantly by neighborhood. Arrest rates that don't match crime statistics. Community complaints that seem to follow certain patterns. The room had gone completely silent. Officers who'd been whispering and checking their phones were now paying full attention. "I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame," Washington said, "but I am here to ensure that this department operates at the highest level of professionalism and serves all citizens equally." Tommy's hands were clenched in his lap. He could feel sweat starting to form on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Starting Monday, we'll be implementing some new procedures. All arrests will require detailed documentation and justification. Body cameras will be mandatory for all interactions with the public, and footage will be reviewed regularly. Officers will be paired with community liaisons for certain types of calls." Officer Davis shifted nervously behind Tommy and Jake. Several other veterans were exchanging worried looks. "I'll be conducting individual meetings with each officer over the next 2 weeks," Washington continued. "I want to understand your experiences, your concerns, and your perspectives on how we can better serve our community." The lieutenant paused again, and when he spoke next, his tone became even more serious. "I want to be very clear about expectations. This department will operate with transparency, accountability, and respect for every citizen's rights. Officers who demonstrate these qualities will find me to be a supportive supervisor. Officers who prefer other approaches will find themselves facing very different circumstances." Tommy felt like the room was closing in around him. Everything Washington was saying sounded like a direct challenge to the way he'd been doing police work for 15 years. "I know some of you may have concerns about these changes," Washington said, his gaze seeming to linger on the front row. "Change is never easy, but I'm confident that this department can become a model for community policing while maintaining the highest standards of law enforcement." Captain Rodriguez stepped back to the podium. "Lieutenant Washington's office will be in Lieutenant Patterson's old space. Please give him your full cooperation as he transitions into his new role." As the meeting broke up, Tommy and Jake sat frozen in their seats while officers filed out around them. Other cops were already forming small groups whispering about what they'd just heard. Some looked worried. Others seemed curious about the changes. "This is not good," Jake whispered. Tommy finally stood up, his legs feeling unsteady. "Internal Affairs," he muttered. "They sent us someone from Internal Affairs." They walked back to their desks in silence, both men lost in their own thoughts. The confident swagger that had carried them through the morning was completely gone. In its place was a growing sense that the comfortable world they'd built over 15 years was about to be torn apart. Lieutenant Washington had made his message crystal clear without ever raising his voice or making direct threats. The old way of doing things was over. The new way would require justification, documentation, and accountability. For the first time in years, Tommy and Jake's badges felt like targets instead of shields, and they had no idea how to handle what was coming next. Lieutenant Washington didn't waste any time. By Monday morning, new procedures were posted on every bulletin board in the station. Body cameras were no longer optional for any public interaction. Every arrest required a detailed report with specific justification. Community liaison officers would accompany patrols in certain neighborhoods. Tommy stared at the new requirements list, feeling his blood pressure rise with each bullet point. 15 years of experience, and now he had to explain every decision like he was a rookie fresh out of the academy. "This is insane," he muttered to Jake as they prepared for their shift. "How are we supposed to do our jobs with all this bureaucracy?" Jake was studying the new arrest documentation form. It was 3 pages long and required explanations for everything from initial contact reasons to de-escalation attempts. "Look at this thing. By the time we fill out all these forms, the criminals will have moved to the next state." Their first test came sooner than expected. Wednesday afternoon, they got a call about suspicious activity at the same East Side apartment complex where they'd questioned the college student the week before. Tommy felt a familiar confidence returning as they drove toward the scene. This was the kind of call where their experience mattered. The complaint was vague, as usual. Someone had called about people who don't belong in the area hanging around the parking lot. When Tommy and Jake arrived, they found two young men standing near a car with the hood up, apparently trying to fix something under the hood. Both men were black, probably in their 20s, wearing casual clothes and baseball caps. One was holding what looked like a cell phone, probably using the flashlight to see the engine better. Tommy activated his body camera with obvious reluctance. He'd gotten used to handling these situations his own way, without having every word and gesture record. Ed for later review. "Good afternoon," he called out as they approached. "We got a call about some activity over here. What's going on?" The young man with the phone looked up, squinting in the afternoon sun. "Hi, officer. Just trying to figure out why my car won't start. My friend here knows about engines." Jake positioned himself where he could see both men clearly. "This your car?" "Yes, sir. I live in Building B right over there. Been having trouble with it all week." Tommy looked around the parking lot, noting the apartment numbers visible on the nearby buildings. Something about the scene bothered him, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. "You got registration for the vehicle?" The young man nodded and walked toward the driver's side door. "It's in the glove compartment. Let me grab it." Slowly, Tommy said, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt. The young man froze. "I'm just getting my registration. That's what you asked for, right? Just move slowly and keep your hands where we can see them." Tommy's partner Jake was watching the second young man, who had stepped back from the car and was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "Here's the registration," the first young man said, holding out a folded paper. "And here's my license. The car's registered to my grandmother, but I'm on the insurance." Tommy examined the documents carefully. Everything seemed to be in order, but his instincts were telling him something wasn't right. In his experience, people who belonged in a place didn't get nervous when police showed up. "What's in the car?" Jake asked. "Nothing unusual. Just my work clothes, some tools, couple of textbooks. Mind if we take a look?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Tommy could see the young man thinking it over, which in his mind was another red flag. Innocent people didn't hesitate to cooperate. "I guess that's okay," the young man said finally. "But I don't understand why you need to search my car. I haven't done anything wrong." Tommy opened the passenger door and looked inside. The car was clean but lived in. Work clothes in the back seat, just like the young man had said. A couple of community college textbooks. Some tools that looked like they belonged to someone who worked on cars. But Tommy's attention was caught by something else. A small plastic bag wedged between the seat cushions, barely visible. "What's this?" he asked, pulling out the bag. The young man looked genuinely confused. "I don't know. I've never seen that before." The bag contained what looked like a small amount of white powder. Tommy held it up to the light, his pulse quickening. This was the kind of discovery that could justify all the questions and suspicion. "You're telling me you don't know how this got in your car?" "I swear I don't know what that is. This is my grandmother's car. Other people have driven it." Jake stepped closer to his partner. "Looks like probable cause to me." The second young man spoke up for the first time. "Look, officers, I was just helping with the engine. This isn't even my car. I don't know anything about whatever you found." Tommy was already reaching for his handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Wait," the first young man said, panic creeping into his voice. "Can we talk about this? I really don't know how that got there. I work at the auto shop downtown. I go to school at night. I don't do drugs." "That's what they all say," Tommy replied, cuffing the young man and reading him his rights. The arrest took another 20 minutes. Both young men were taken to the station, and the car was impounded for a more thorough search. Tommy felt the familiar satisfaction that came with getting a dangerous criminal off the streets. It wasn't until they were back at the station that things started to go wrong. Lieutenant Washington appeared at Tommy's desk while he was typing up the arrest report. "Officer Chen, could I see you in my office?" Tommy's confidence faltered slightly, but he followed the lieutenant down the hall. Washington's office still smelled like fresh paint and new furniture. The walls were bare except for his certificates and commendations. "Have a seat," Washington said, settling behind his desk with a file folder. "I've been reviewing your arrest from this afternoon." Straightforward drug possession case, Tommy said. Found contraband during a lawful search of the vehicle. Washington opened the folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. I've been looking at the body camera footage. I've also been reviewing the evidence log and your incident report. Something in Washington's tone made Tommy's stomach tighten. The bag you found contained baking soda. Washington continued calmly. The lab ran a quick field test while you were processing the arrest. Tommy felt the blood drain from his face. That's impossible. It looked like what you expected to find, Washington interrupted. The question is why you expected to find it. The lieutenant pulled out a printed transcript. I've had the body camera audio transcribed. You approached two citizens who were attempting to repair a disabled vehicle. They cooperated fully with your requests. They provided identification and registration. They consented to a search. Washington leaned forward slightly. But your incident report describes them as evasive and suspicious. You wrote that they appeared to be engaging in criminal activity. The body camera footage tells a different story. Tommy tried to maintain his composure. Sometimes the camera doesn't capture everything. There are subtleties, body language, instincts that come from experience. I have 22 years of experience, Washington said quietly. I've reviewed thousands of hours of body camera footage. I've investigated hundreds of cases involving officer conduct. He placed another document on the desk. This is a complaint filed by the young man you arrested. He's a pre-engineering student at the community college. He works 30 hours a week at Johnson's Auto Repair downtown. No criminal record. No prior police contact. Washington's voice remained calm and professional, but Tommy could sense the steel underneath. His friend is a mechanic who was helping him diagnose a transmission problem. Also no criminal record. Also a working member of our community. People lie, Tommy said defensively. Clean records don't mean anything. You learn to read people. After a while, you learn to see what you expect to see, Washington corrected. The question is whether your expectations are based on evidence or on assumptions. The lieutenant closed the file and looked directly at Tommy. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Why did you approach those two men with suspicion instead of offering assistance? Tommy felt trapped. The honest answer was that two young black men in that neighborhood at that time of day fit a profile he'd developed over years of police work. But he couldn't say that out loud, especially not to Lieutenant Washington. It was a suspicious activity call, he said finally. We were responding to a complaint. The complaint was called in by Mrs. Henderson in Building A, Washington said, consulting his notes. She's 83 years old and calls the police every time she sees anyone in the parking lot she doesn't recognize. She's made 47 similar calls in the past year. None of them resulted in arrests or citations. Washington stood up and walked to the window. Officer Chen, I'm going to be very clear with you. The young man you arrested this afternoon is going to file a formal complaint. The district attorney is going to review this case and probably decline to prosecute. Mrs. Henderson is going to continue calling in suspicious activity reports every time she sees someone she doesn't recognize. He turned back to face Tommy. But more importantly, two members of our community who were minding their own business and trying to fix a car are now going to think twice about trusting police officers when they need help. Tommy sat in silence, feeling the weight of Washington's words. I want you to think very carefully about how you approach your job. Washington continued. Your badge gives you authority, but it doesn't give you the right to treat citizens like suspects simply because they don't match your expectations about who belongs where. The meeting ended with Tommy feeling more shaken than he wanted to admit. As he walked back to his desk, he could feel other officers watching him. Word traveled fast in a police station, and everyone would know within an hour that the new lieutenant had called him in for a private conversation. Jake was waiting at their shared desk, looking worried. How bad was it? Tommy slumped into his chair. Bad. The stuff we found was baking soda. The kid's a college student with no record. Washington has the whole thing on camera. So what happens now? Tommy looked around the bullpen, noting which officers were watching them and which were pointedly looking away. For the first time in 15 years, he felt like everyone in the room was judging him instead of respecting him. "Now we learn to do things differently," he said quietly, "or we find ourselves looking for new jobs." The meeting with Lieutenant Washington changed everything for Tommy, but not in the way the lieutenant probably hoped. Instead of reflection and reform, Tommy felt angry and defensive. He'd been doing police work the same way for 15 years, and suddenly he was being treated like a criminal because of one mistake. By Thursday morning, Tommy was actively building resistance among the other officers. He started with the veterans, who'd worked under Patterson for years, planting seeds of doubt about Washington's leadership style. "Guy's been here 1 week and he's already micromanaging everything we do," Tommy complained to Officer Davis in the break room. "Pretty. Soon we'll need permission to write a traffic ticket." Davis nodded sympathetically. "I heard he wants to review all our arrest reports personally, like we're rookies who can't be trusted." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Tommy said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "He's treating experienced officers like we don't know how to do our jobs. Meanwhile, the real criminals are laughing at us because they know we're too busy filling out forms to actually catch them." The campaign worked. Within a few days, Tommy had several allies who shared his frustration with the new procedures. They began meeting informally after shifts, sharing stories about ridiculous paperwork requirements and discussing how the department was becoming too political. Jake, meanwhile, was having a very different experience. Lieutenant Washington had paired him with Officer Rodriguez, a 5-year veteran who specialized in community outreach. At first, Jake had been reluctant about the assignment, but Rodriguez turned out to be nothing like what he'd expected. "The trick is to remember that most people want the same things we do," Rodriguez explained as they responded to a domestic disturbance call. "Safe neighborhoods, respect for their property, protection for their families. When we approach people like they're potential allies instead of potential threats, we usually get better results." The domestic call was at a small house on the south side, where neighbors had reported shouting and the sound of breaking glass. Jake's usual approach would have been to arrive with authority, separate the parties, and determine who needed to be arrested. But Rodriguez suggested a different strategy. They knocked on the door and introduced themselves calmly, asking if everyone was okay and if they could help solve whatever problem was happening. What they found was a young couple in the middle of a financial crisis. The husband had lost his job 2 weeks earlier, and they'd been fighting about unpaid bills. The breaking glass had been a coffee mug thrown in frustration, not violence. Both people were stressed and scared, not dangerous. Instead of arrests or citations, Rodriguez spent 20 minutes connecting the couple with social services and job placement programs. He gave them information about food banks and utility assistance programs. By the time they left, the situation had de-escalated completely. "How do you know about all those resources?" Jake asked as they drove away. "Part of the job," Rodriguez said. "You can't solve everything with handcuffs. Sometimes people need help, not punishment." Jake found himself thinking about that call for the rest of the week. He'd handled dozens of similar situations over the years, but he'd never considered that there might be alternatives to the standard arrest and move-on approach. The breaking point came the following Monday. Tommy had been building his resistance movement for 2 weeks, and he decided it was time to make a formal challenge to Washington's authority. He filed a grievance with the police union, claiming that the new lieutenant was creating a hostile work environment and interfering with effective police work. The grievance detailed several complaints: excessive paperwork requirements, micromanagement of experienced officers, and policies that favored criminals over law enforcement. Tommy had gotten 8 other officers to sign the document, including Davis and 2 other veterans from the patrol division. But when Tommy went to present the grievance to Jake, expecting his partner's automatic support, he was shocked by Jake's response. "I'm not signing that," Jake said quietly. "What do you mean you're not signing it? We've been partners for 3 years. We've always backed each other up." Jake looked uncomfortable, but his voice was steady. "I don't agree with it. Washington's not micromanaging us, he's holding us accountable. There's a difference." Tommy stared at his partner in disbelief. "Are you kidding me? After everything we've been through together, you're going to side with some outsider who's been here 2 weeks? I'm not siding with anyone, Jake said. I'm just saying that maybe some of these changes aren't such a bad thing. The argument that followed was the worst fight they'd had in their entire partnership. Tommy accused Jake of being weak and naive. Jake accused Tommy of being stubborn and unwilling to adapt. Other officers in the bullpen stopped what they were doing to listen to the confrontation. The fight ended with Tommy storming out, leaving Jake sitting at his desk feeling like his world had been turned upside down. Their partnership, which had been the foundation of his police career, was falling apart. That afternoon, Lieutenant Washington called Jake into his office. Jake expected another lecture about proper procedures and community relations. Instead, he found Washington reviewing a commendation letter. "Officer Thompson," Washington said, looking up from his paperwork, "I've been getting some interesting feedback about your recent performance." Jake braced himself for criticism, but Washington's tone was neutral. "Officer Rodriguez tells me you've been an excellent partner on the community outreach assignments. Says you've shown real aptitude for de-escalation and problem-solving." Jake wasn't sure how to respond. "I'm just trying to do the job, sir." Washington leaned back in his chair. "I've also heard about the situation with your regular partner. I know that can't be easy." "Tommy's a good cop," Jake said loyally. "He's just having trouble adjusting to the changes." "And you're not?" Jake thought about the question carefully. "The changes make sense to me. We're still doing police work, just doing it better." Washington nodded. "I want to offer you an opportunity. There's a new community policing initiative starting next month. It would involve working directly with neighborhood leaders, social services, and community organizations. It's real police work, but it requires a different skill set." Jake felt a flicker of interest. "What kind of work?" "Problem solving instead of just incident response. Building relationships instead of just making arrests. Preventing crime instead of just reacting to it." Washington pulled out a folder and handed it to Jake. "Take a look at this and think it over. It would mean a new partner and a different kind of schedule, but I think you'd be good at it." That evening, Jake went home and read through the community policing program materials. The more he read, the more interested he became. The program involved working with residents to identify and solve problems before they became criminal issues. It meant building trust instead of fear, cooperation instead of confrontation. For the first time in months, Jake felt excited about going to work. Meanwhile, Tommy was meeting with his group of disgruntled officers at their usual bar. The grievance had been filed, and they were waiting for the union representative to schedule a meeting with Captain Rodriguez. "The way I see it," Tommy said, finishing his second beer, "we need to show Washington that he can't just come in here and change everything overnight. We've got 15 years of experience between us. We know how to do this job." Officer Davis raised his glass. "To real police work." The other officers echoed the toast, but Tommy noticed that the enthusiasm wasn't quite as strong as it had been a week earlier. Some of the men seemed to be having second thoughts about the confrontation. "What if he's right about some things?" Officer Stevens asked quietly. "I mean, some of the new procedures actually make sense." Tommy turned on him immediately. "Don't tell me you're going soft, too. Next thing you know, you'll be holding hands with the community activists and singing songs about understanding." Stevens looked hurt by the sarcasm. "I'm just saying that maybe we don't have to fight every change. Maybe some of them are improvements." The meeting ended on a sour note, with Tommy realizing that his support was eroding faster than he'd expected. Even his core group of allies was beginning to question whether fighting Washington was worth the effort. As he drove home alone that night, Tommy felt more isolated than he ever had in his entire career. His partner had abandoned him. His fellow officers were wavering, and Lieutenant Washington seemed to be winning the battle for the soul of the department without even breaking a sweat. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Tommy started to wonder if maybe he was the one who was wrong. But admitting that would mean acknowledging that everything he'd believed about police work for the past 15 years had been misguided, and Tommy wasn't ready to face that possibility. Not yet. 3 weeks after their confrontation, Jake found himself sitting in Lieutenant Washington's office accepting the community policing assignment. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating. He was walking away from everything familiar about his police career, but he was also walking towards something that felt more meaningful. His new partner was Officer Lisa Chen, a 7-year veteran, who had been working community outreach programs for the past 2 years. She was nothing like Tommy, methodical where Tommy was impulsive, thoughtful where Tommy was reactive, focused on prevention where Tommy focused on enforcement. The first thing you need to understand, Lisa explained on their first day together, is that community policing is still police work. We're just using different tools to solve problems. Their first assignment was the East Side apartment complex, the same place where Tommy and Jake had made their disastrous arrest attempt. But instead of responding to complaints, they were meeting with residents to understand ongoing concerns and develop solutions. Jake walked into the community center, feeling nervous. The last time he'd been in this neighborhood, he'd helped arrest an innocent college student for possession of baking soda. He wasn't sure how residents would react to seeing him again. What he found surprised him. The meeting was led by Mrs. Patterson, a retired teacher who had lived in the complex for 12 years. She was organized, articulate, and clearly frustrated with problems that went far beyond police matters. "We need better lighting in the parking areas," she explained, pointing to a map of the complex. "Half the streetlights are burned out and management won't replace them. That's when we get people hanging around who don't belong here." Jake realized this was probably what had led to Mrs. Henderson's suspicious activity calls. Poor lighting made residents nervous about anyone they didn't immediately recognize. "What about talking to the property management company?" Lisa suggested. "Sometimes they're more responsive when police officers are involved in the conversation." An older man named Mr. Rodriguez raised his hand. "We've tried that. They say it's too expensive, but they keep raising our rent every year." Jake found himself taking notes, something he'd never done during Tommy's approach to community problems. Instead of looking for people to arrest, he was looking for problems to solve. The meeting continued for an hour, with residents discussing everything, from inadequate trash pickup to concerns about speeding cars through the complex. Jake began to see a pattern. Most of the problems that generated police calls were actually quality-of-life issues that could be addressed through cooperation and problem-solving. Over the following weeks, Jake threw himself into the community policing program with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including himself. He learned about city ordinances that could require property managers to maintain adequate lighting. He discovered social services programs that could help families facing financial crises. He began building relationships with community leaders who had previously viewed police with suspicion. The breakthrough moment came during his 3rd week on the assignment. He was patrolling the East Side complex when he saw a familiar figure, the young man Tommy had arrested for possession of baking soda. The student was carrying a toolbox and heading toward a car with its hood up. Jake's first instinct was to avoid the encounter. The arrest had been embarrassing for the entire department, and he wasn't sure how the young man would react to seeing him again. But his training with Lisa had emphasized the importance of rebuilding trust after negative encounters. Taking a deep breath, Jake approached the young man. "Excuse me?" he called out. "Devin, right?" The young man looked up, immediately tense. "Yes, officer. Is there a problem?" "No problem," Jake said, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I actually wanted to apologize for what happened a few weeks ago. That whole situation was handled badly, and I'm sorry you had to go through that." Devin stared at him in surprise. "You're apologizing?" "Yes. You were just trying to fix your car and we treated you like a criminal. That wasn't right." The tension in Devin's shoulders eased slightly. "I appreciate that. It was pretty scary being arrested for something I didn't do." Jake nodded. "I can imagine. Are you having car trouble again?" "Different car, same problem," Devin said with a slight smile. "I think I'm cursed when it comes to automotive repair." Without thinking, Jake found himself offering to help. He'd learned basic car maintenance from his father, and it turned out Devin just needed someone to hold a flashlight while he reconnected a loose battery cable. As they worked together, they talked. Devin explained his pre-engineering program at the community college, his part-time job at the auto shop, his plans to transfer to the state university next year. Jake found himself genuinely interested in the young man's goals and impressed by his determination to succeed despite the challenges he faced. "Can I ask you something?" Devon said as they finished with the car. "Why are you being so nice to me? Last time I saw you, you guys were pretty convinced I was some kind of drug dealer." Jake thought about the question carefully. "Because I learned that being suspicious of everyone isn't the same thing as being a good police officer. Sometimes people just need help, not enforcement." When Jake told Lisa about the encounter, she smiled approvingly. "That's exactly what community policing is supposed to accomplish. You're building relationships instead of just responding to incidents." Meanwhile, Tommy's situation was getting worse. The union grievance had backfired spectacularly. Instead of supporting his complaints about Lieutenant Washington, the union representative had pointed out that all the new procedures were well within departmental policy and actually aligned with current best practices in law enforcement. Captain Rodriguez had been less than sympathetic during their meeting. "Officer Chen, you have 15 years of experience, but experience without adaptation becomes a liability. Lieutenant Washington is implementing changes that will make this department more effective and more accountable. I suggest you find a way to work within the new system." Tommy's group of allies had dwindled to just 2 officers, and even they were starting to question whether continuing the resistance was worth the career damage it was causing. Several officers who had initially supported Tommy were now actively avoiding him, afraid that association with his complaints would hurt their own standing with the new lieutenant. The final blow came when Tommy was called into Washington's office for what he assumed would be another lecture about proper procedures. Instead, he found Washington reviewing his personnel file with a serious expression. "Officer Chen," Washington said without preamble, "I've been reviewing your performance over the past month, and I'm concerned about several patterns I'm seeing." Tommy braced himself for criticism, but Washington's tone was more disappointed than angry. "Your arrest rate has dropped significantly, but not because crime has decreased in your patrol area. Your incident reports have become increasingly brief and defensive. Other officers have expressed concerns about your attitude and cooperation." Washington closed the file and looked directly at Tommy. "I'm placing you on administrative leave pending a full review of your recent performance and conduct." The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. Administrative leave was one step away from termination, and everyone in the department would know about it within hours. "This is because I filed a grievance," Tommy said angrily. "You're retaliating against me for standing up for my rights." "This is because you've chosen to fight necessary changes instead of adapting to them," Washington replied calmly. "You've created a hostile environment for other officers and failed to maintain professional standards in your interactions with the community." Tommy left the meeting feeling like his 15-year career was crashing down around him. As he cleaned out his locker, he could see other officers watching him with a mixture of sympathy and relief. Some of them had been part of his resistance movement, but none of them offered support now. Jake heard about Tommy's suspension within an hour. Despite their recent conflicts, he felt genuinely sorry for his former partner. Tommy had taught him a lot about police work in their years together, even if some of those lessons had turned out to be wrong. That evening, Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. He drove to Tommy's house and knocked on the door. Tommy answered, looking haggard and defeated. "What do you want, Jake? Come to gloat?" "I came to check on you," Jake said. "I know we've had our differences lately, but we were partners for 3 years. That has to count for something." Tommy let him in, and they sat in the living room where they'd shared many beers and war stories over the years. The atmosphere was awkward, but Jake pressed on. "Tommy, I think you should consider talking to Lieutenant Washington about the community policing program. It's not what you think it is." "I'm not going to beg for my job," Tommy said bitterly. "I'm not talking about begging. I'm talking about learning. The program has taught me more about real police work in a month than I learned in 3 years of arrests and citations." Jake spent the next hour describing his experiences with community policing. He talked about problem solving instead of just incident response, about building trust instead of fear, about preventing crime instead of just reacting to it. "You always said the best police work happens when citizens cooperate with us instead of fighting us," Jake said. "That's exactly what community policing accomplishes. Tommy listened in silence, his defensive anger gradually giving way to something that might have been curiosity. 2 days later, Tommy made a call to Lieutenant Washington's office. The conversation was difficult and painful, requiring him to acknowledge mistakes and express willingness to change. But Washington listened without judgment and offered Tommy a path back to active duty through the community policing program. 6 months later, Jake received a commendation for his work in reducing crime rates in the East Side neighborhood through community engagement and problem-solving initiatives. The ceremony was held in the main briefing room, with Lieutenant Washington presenting the award in front of the entire department. Tommy watched from the back of the room, wearing his uniform again after completing the community policing training program. He'd been partnered with Officer Martinez, a patient veteran who was helping him learn new approaches to situations he'd been handling the same way for 15 years. It wasn't easy. Tommy still struggled with his instincts to see threats instead of opportunities, suspects instead of citizens. But he was learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, that real police work required more than authority and suspicion. As Jake shook hands with Lieutenant Washington and accepted his commendation, Tommy realized that his former partner had become the kind of police officer Tommy had always claimed to be, someone who made the community safer through skill, judgment, and genuine care for the people he served. For the first time in months, Tommy felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope that he could become that kind of officer too. The badge hadn't made them untouchable after all, but it had given them the opportunity to touch lives in ways they'd never imagined, if they were brave enough to learn how to use it properly.